I will begin with an overview of our model, the Conscious Turing Machine, or the CTM. Manuel will present more details, discuss the feeling of consciousness in the CTM, the hard problem for pain, and give some explanatory examples. We will end with some questions, problems, and suggestions for future directions. What is consciousness? Roughly speaking, consciousness or conscious awareness is everything you pay attention to, awake or dreaming, but not dreamless sleep. It's what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you smell, what you taste, your joys, fears, sorrows, pains, but most especially, it's your inner private speech. It's what gives you the sense of self. Until about 30 years ago, the scientific study of consciousness was taboo. Then in 1988, cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Baars published A Cognitive Theory of Consciousness, where he discusses the Global Workspace Theory. And then in 1990, with the advent of the fMRI technology, neuroscientists were able to look inside, non-intrusively, the brain and see the activity when people were performing conscious tasks. In 1995, Francis Crick wrote the Astonishing Hypothesis, where he talks about neural correlates as a way of understanding consciousness. Well, there are various approaches to the study of consciousness. We're actually coming from the cognitive neuroscience perspective, and we're very influenced by Bernard Baars, Stanislas Dehaene, Alan Turing. And I'd like to mention that their work actually, in turn, was influenced by a lot of work on cognition, much of which happened at Carnegie Mellon with Alan Turing, Herb Simon, Raj Reddy, and John Anderson. And they take an architectural approach, which is very much the approach that we are going to take here. Well, what can mathematics and theoretical computer science contribute to the discussion of consciousness? Well, we too want to understand consciousness. We want to give a simple mathematical model to help us get this understanding. This is something that makes sense for us, that we seem to do quite well, and to take complicated theories and sort of look at the essence. We want to give a good definition of chunk. You may know that in 1950, the psychologist George Miller talked about the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. And what he's trying to say is that that's about the amount of information that you can keep in your short-term memory at any moment of time. It influenced the length of telephone numbers at one time, so forth. So what is a chunk? It could be a word, it could be a digit, it could be a poem where you know at first you have in your consciousness the first phrase, and that leads to the second phrase and the third phrase and so forth, and then you can spew out a whole poem. So what we'd like to give a formal definition of this informal notion of chunk. We want to distinguish between simulating and experiencing. We want properties of consciousness to be emergent, not programmed in. We are not looking for a model of the brain, nor of learning or cognition. We are looking for a model of consciousness. We are looking for simplicity, not complexity. And of course, we would like to build such a conscious AI, and we're working with our colleague, Jean-Louis Villacroze. In 1995, the philosopher David Chalmers started to talk about the easy and hard problems for consciousness. And what Chalmers says is that the easy problems of consciousness are those that seem directly susceptible to the standard methods of cognitive science, whereby a phenomenon explains in terms of the computational or neural mechanisms. This is called the functional or access consciousness. But the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there's also a subjective aspect, and that's called phenomenal consciousness. Well, the hard problem is usually associated with the word qualia, the feeling of what it is like, the feeling of what it is like to be a bat. Many focus on what it feels like when you see red. And when I show this red here, different people have different feelings depending on your background, your experience, or where you live, east or west. Here's our formulation of the easy and hard problems. We say the easy problem for us is to make a robot that simulates feelings, for example, of pain and joy. And the hard problem is to make a robot that truly experiences these feelings of pain and joy. And here you have Sophia simulating emotions. She's going through a gamut, but she ends up with an expression of pleasure and joy. Although Sophia's expressions may simulate pleasure, she has acute anhedonia, and philosophers may say she's a zombie. In humans, anhedonia is the reduced ability to experience pleasure. It's often caused by damage to nucleus accumbens. Okay, you can also see robots on the web simulating pain. And here, if you look at this particular YouTube, which I'm not going to show, the pain seems to be so excruciating that it's painful to watch. But nevertheless, this robot has pain asymbolia, and pain asymbolia in humans is a condition in which pain is experienced without unpleasantness. And there could be insensitivity to pain or indifference to pain. And Manuel will talk about this phenomena in his part. Our view of consciousness is that consciousness is a property of all properly organized computing systems, whether made of flesh and blood or metal and silicon. And our thesis is the architecture of these systems is what makes them conscious. Later on, I will add to this it's not just the architecture, but it has to do with the processors and the dynamics as well. I will talk about that shortly. And our architecture explains the brain at a very high level of abstraction, at a level well above that of neurons. We'll give a formal definition of a machine for consciousness. We call it the Conscious Turing Machine, the CTM, or conscious AI. We define consciousness in that model, then point out properties of consciousness in the model. After all, these will be definitions, and we'll have to give explanatory reasons why the model may have the experience of consciousness. Then we'll also talk about that aspect. We are inspired by Turing's simple yet powerful model of a computer that helps give understanding of computation. And as you know, here's a small 23-state universal Turing machine that can compute anything that you can compute in the cloud or with a supercomputer. But you can get your head around the Turing machine, not the cloud, and thus inspired by Turing, we're again aiming for simplicity, not complexity. Our architecture formalizes the theater or global workspace model of cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Baars. And Baars describes awareness through a theater analogy. Consciousness for Baars, as Baars says, is like the activity of actors in a play performing on a stage of working or short-term memory, that's the STM. The inner speech actor is often on stage. Their performance is under observation by a huge audience of unconscious processes and long-term memory that are sitting in the dark, some of whom may want to get their information or their point of view up on the stage. This may have happened to you once or twice. You're at a party, you see someone you know, but for the life of you, you can't remember her name. Then, about a half hour later, when you're home, her name pops up into your consciousness. What's going on? Well, what's her name gets broadcast down to all the unconscious processors, and perhaps one processor recalls where you first met. In a computer science class, it goes up to short-term memory and then gets broadcast down to all the long-term memory processors. And then another processor remembers something about what she does. Oh, she's in machine learning. That gets up to short-term memory, then gets broadcast down to all the long-term processors. Her name becomes with a T. That gets up to short-term memory, gets broadcast down, and so forth. And about a half hour later, her name comes up to the stage, to the conscious short-term memory from the audience of unconscious long-term memory processors, which has been thinking, searching. The conscious self on stage doesn't know quite how or where her name was found. And then there's the well-known story of Poincaré. Well, here's Baars' model of consciousness. At the center, we have our working storage, and that's our short-term memory, or our stage. And at the bottom here, we have many, many long-term memory processors. That's the audience. On the left, we have input from the outside world, from the environment. It's coming through sensors like vision, hearing, and touch. And then from working storage or short-term memory, there's an output going to the outside world by way of action and actuators. And right in the middle, there's a central executive who performs the function, let's say, of a stage manager or a drama director. Now for our conscious Turing machine. We start with a tiny short-term memory. It's a read-write memory. That's our stage. And on stage, an actor can hold one chunk of information. Now, that's not the 7 plus or 2 chunks that George Miller suggests, but by cycling through short-term memory, we could simulate 7 plus or minus 2 chunks if we wish. But since we can get away with one chunk and we're aiming for simplicity, that will do for us. We also have an enormous collection of long-term memory processors. This is our audience. They are powerful, they're parallel. At first, they're not connected, but eventually some of them will become connected via links. We imagine about 10 to the 7th of these. This is maybe in accordance to the 10 to the 7th cortical columns in the brain, which does a lot of the heavy-duty activity. We might think of this audience members as our sleeping experts, because they are indeed the experts in one or multiple activities that we shall need. The CTM does not have an essential executive. We have found that the central executive functions can emerge naturally from the long-term memory processors, from the dynamics of the CTM. So again, in terms of simplicity, we've eliminated the central executive. We have a down tree, which is a very simple tree, that will eventually take chunks from short-term memory and broadcast them down to all long-term memory processors. We have a binary up tree, and that tree will be what we utilize for our competitions for our sleeping experts to get their information on stage. The CTM also has input maps from the external world to the long-term memory processors. These maps take information through sensors like eyes and ears and map them to various relevant processors. They also translate worldish to the internal language, the inner language of the CTM, which we call brainish. Brainish is the inner language used by the processors in the Conscious Turing Machine to communicate with each other. It is a multimodal language used to express inner speech, inner vision, and inner sensations, expressed in words and phrases called GIFs. It is richer and more expressive than outer languages, such as English or Chinese. Having the expressive inner language is an important component of the feeling of consciousness. And Manuel will talk more about this. If you notice in our model, the inputs are coming directly to the long-term memory processors. They're not going through short-term memory. Again, short-term memory is really a folder for a chunk of information that's going to be broadcast. Also, we have output maps from certain processors to actuators to affect the outside world, the environment. And again, brainish is translated into worldish in these output maps. And again, this map goes directly from the long-term memory process to the external world. So let me tell you how the Uptreat competition works. We start with all the processors put a chunk into the competition. This is information that they want to get up to short-term memory. It could be a query, an answer to a query, some other important information that they want everybody to know about. Formally, we define a chunk as a six-tuple. Chunk PT here is the chunk that processor P puts into competition at time T. It consists of an address, that is the address of processor P, and if there are 10 to the 7 processors, that address is a 7-digit number. Then T, then the gist. The gist is a small amount of information that processor P wants to get into short-term memory and then to convey to the other processors. The weight is the value or the importance that processor P gives to its gist, and it can be positive or negative. The intensity is the absolute value of the weight, and it's the pressure that processor P feels to get its chunk into short-term memory, and the mood starts off as the weight. As the chunk moves up the competition, the address, the time, the gist, and the weight will stay the same. The intensities and the moods may change. Let me give you a simple example of an uptreat competition. The one we use is really not too more difficult than this. In general, we want the competition to be easy and quick. So here's a competition going up. So let's see how this works. So at every node, what I've done is only giving you two parts of the tuple. I give you some information about the gist and something about the current mood. So let's see what's happening here. So it looks like here the pain processor put a chunk into the competition. And also we have the pain processor putting a chunk into the competition. Also the joy processor puts a competition into the competition. And their chunks rise to a certain point where a decision has to be made in the competition, which wins the local competition here. So here we have our decision is going to be made on the largest absolute value of the mood. So pain has the largest absolute value here, -5, and so it's going to win the competition. And the function that actually changes the mood is the sum of these two moods. So -5 plus 3 is -2. So in fact, in some ways here, because there was a pain of -5, the joy of +3 somehow mitigated the pain a bit, so the pain goes down. Now let's see what happens at this juncture. Pain of -2 is competing with fear of -5. Again, the largest absolute value of the mood here is of fear. Then fear wins out, and then the moods sum up. -2 and -5 gives you -7, and that's something that you would expect. Pain and more fear together would make fear even exacerbate the fear even more. So that's the model that we use here. The competition algorithms in general have two parts to them. You have to choose the local winner, and then you have to have the properties of the chunk that moves up the competition tree. In general, our model of choice is a probabilistic model. Manuel will talk about this later on, and it has some very nice properties. So, for example, most of you have looked at this competition that I gave you and will realize right away that if we permute some of the processors, we may get a totally different outcome, even though we don't change the chunks that they submit to the competition. A very nice property of the probabilistic Conscious Turing Machine is that the winner is totally independent. The probability of a winner is totally independent of the location of the processor. So one can permute the processors, and that's inconsequential to the results. So that's a nice property. As soon as a chunk wins the competition and gets into short-term memory, it is immediately broadcast down to all long-term memory processors, and they get this information right away. What this does, besides just giving general information, it gives a lot of feedback to the long-term memory processors. So, for example, one processor might have really had the right answer to a query, but it found out it didn't get its chunk up into short-term memory. Perhaps it was too humble. On the other hand, maybe a processor was too egotistical or too bold and gave too much weight to its chunk, and it actually got up into short-term memory, got broadcast down, and then at another turn, it found out it was wrong. Come to rescue the sleeping experts algorithm, Avram's sleeping experts algorithm. So what the sleeping experts algorithm tends to do is it tends to balance things out. So for that bold processor, it will lower its weight. And for that humble processor, it'll boost its weight next time around. So that's one of the mechanisms, the learning mechanism, important learning mechanism for dealing with feedback in our system. So let's review some of the conscious Turing machine dynamics. First, we have inputs coming in from the external world. These are through sensors, and these are providing information. The input maps are providing information to certain of the long-term memory processors. At each moment in time, all the processors are putting chunks into competitions, and maybe at this moment in time, when fear gets this input from the external world, it puts a chunk into the competition and it actually wins. That chunk is broadcast then down to all the long-term memory processors, and perhaps the inner speech processor decides it's going to really act on this. Sees something very fearful. It decides it's going to send an output map to the external world to actuate the screaming mechanism. We call this ensemble predictive dynamics. So it consists of the prediction that when a processor puts a chunk into the competition or sends a message to the output map, that's the kind of prediction. There's the competition that goes on, and feedback either comes through the short-term memory broadcast or from input from the external world. And then internally in each of the long-term memory processors, we have learning going on. And one of the major things is the sleeping expert's algorithm. Now for linking. Since the speech processor responded to fear's call, a link will form between those two processors. And in general, long-term memory processor A will link up to processor B when B answers A's call. This is the Hebbian rule that neurons that fire together wire together. And importantly, linking enables conscious processing to become unconscious. So in other words, when one processor responds to another, links will form over time, more and more links. And so communication now can go between the unconscious processes without having to go through short-term memory. And in fact, this is what happens when we remember what's her name a half hour later. Those processes are, via the links, they're sending information back and forth. That's what happened to Poincaré when he was working on other things. His long-term memory processors were also working furiously, sending information back and forth. So I just gave you the cartoon version of the CTM, sort of like the Turing machine when you see a picture of a little box and the tape going back and forth. But we can formally define the CTM very formally as a 7-tuple. The STM, LTM, downtree, uptree, links, input, output. We define the chunk, as I said before, as a 6-tuple. Formally, we talk about predictive dynamics, prediction, competition, feedback, and learning, and that's sort of part of the formal definition of the CTM. Now for definitions of consciousness in the CTM. We say that the chunk that gets into STM is the conscious content of CTM. And we say that consciousness in the CTM is the awareness, in other words, the reception by all long-term memory processors of the conscious content of CTM. The constant activity of chunks competing to get into STM and then broadcast to LTM, or competing to get into STM and broadcast to LTM, create a stream of consciousness. The reasonableness of our definition of consciousness lies in the number of concepts that the model explains easily and naturally. And I'd like to share with you one. So here we have a living room that looks like an obstacle course. There are tables all over, there are chairs all over, there are rugs that you can trip on, and so forth. And you see this man sitting on the couch on the right-hand side, and there are things in front of him, and there's a door on the left. And this man is asked to go to the other room. Maybe there's food there. And he says, but I can't see. Nevertheless, he gets up and walks through the door, avoiding all the obstacles. What's going on? So what I'd like to do is give you a very high-level explanation using the CTM. So what's happening is the person or the CTM is getting input from the external world, from the eye to the vision processor, maybe from the ear to a hearing, and that gets maybe linked over to the vision processor. And the vision processor is working perfectly well, and it's sending its messages to a walk actuator, and the guy gets up and walks across the room. But the connection to the short-term memory from the vision processor is either non-existent or broken. And so without access to STM from vision, he has no conscious sense that he can see. I'd like to end my part of this presentation by saying a few words about the extended mind. In 98, Andy Clark and David Chalmers talks about the extended mind, and basically what they're saying is our mind is much more than what's inside our head. We make use of libraries, books, information from Google, and so forth. So we utilize a whole lot of other things in the outside world as part of our mind and our mental processes. And here we have Elon Musk's version of the extended mind. Gertrude has an embedded Neuralink. We also say there is an extended conscious Turing machine, and that's in fact what we're really looking at is the extended conscious Turing machine, where we can make use now in the long-term memory processes of all the current wonderful technology there is. So besides our model of the world and our inner speech and our vision processors, we might have Google processors we work with, Wolfram Alpha, Siri, Alpha Zero, and whatever comes along. So we believe also this conscious Turing machine will be able to utilize all the technology and great stuff that everybody's doing these days. So with that, I turn it over to Manuel, who will talk in part 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore. Let's make some points before we begin. The CTM is a formalization of Baars' global theater model. We think it's an extraordinarily insightful model for explaining consciousness. But it's not formally defined. Its definition is vague. It says that audience members decide among themselves who has the information that should get to the stage, but does not say how to decide that. As an undergraduate in Dr. Warren S. McCulloch's neurophysiology lab, I learned that in the Navy, the ship that has the information commands the fleet. An important principle that, but what exactly does it mean? The same question comes up in the theater model. In the theater model, every processor has information to send to the stage. The information is a gist that the processor tags with a numerical weight. The absolute value of the weight indicates the importance and expected correctness of the gist. That's determined by the processor that creates the gist. Probably the processor will make mistakes, it'll get corrected. The sign of the weight indicates if the gist is positive or negative. The weight of a gist is an important factor in deciding if the gist gets to the stage. Let's see how the CTM does this. The probabilistic CTM. There are two models of CTM, the deterministic CTM and the probabilistic CTM. The probabilistic CTM, for many reasons, turns out to be the simpler, better model. The only difference between the two models is that the probabilistic CTM uses a coin flip neuron in every node of the uptree. Aside from that randomness, the probabilistic CTM is totally deterministic. So what's a coin flip neuron? It's a device that takes as input an ordered pair of non-negative real numbers, A and B, and in one step does the following. If A plus B is greater than 0, it outputs A with probability A over A plus B, else it outputs B. If A plus B equals 0, it outputs A with probability 1/2. Here's a picture of the coin flip neuron. And we assume that every node of the uptreat at every level of the tree above the level of the processors has a coin flip neuron. Now for the probabilistic competition algorithm. Let f be an uptree competition function. This means that f maps chunks to non-negative real numbers, where chunks, you recall, a chunk is a six-tuple consisting of an address of the processor that created the chunk, the time it got created, the gist, which is a small amount of information that's carried by the chunk, the weight of that gist being the value of that gist, the intensity being the absolute value of that weight, and the mood being the weight itself. As the chunk moves up, it will turn out that the address, time, gist, and weight will move up unchanged, but the intensity and mood do change. The address, time, gist, and weight of the chunk associated with V is decided probabilistically. The red child on the left, chunk sub L, goes up a level with probability given by its F value divided by the sum of the F values of the red and blue nodes. And if red doesn't go up, then the right blue chunk goes up. Choosing VL, the left child, means putting its address, time, gist, and weight into V. Choosing the right child means putting its address, time, gist, and weight into V. The other two parameters, intensity and mood, of the chunk associated with V are computed very simply. Intensity in V will be the sum of the intensities of the two children, and the mood in V will be the sum of the two moods of its children. Here's a simple example to show how this works. Let f be an additive function. F of x, additive means that f of x plus y equals f of x plus f of y. Suppose that f of the left chunk, the red chunk, is 3, and f of the blue chunk is 1.7. Then with probability 3 divided by 3 plus 1.7, f selects the left chunk. Else it selects the right chunk. And you can see in this picture, there's the left chunk on the left side of the slide, the blue chunk on the right side, and above them the parent. In this particular case, F has chosen the left one to move up, and so the red address, time, gist, and weight move up, but the intensity, both intensities sum to move up, both moods get summed to move up. Here's theorem 2.2. Let F be an additive competition function, then for all P and T, the probability that P wins the competition that began at time T is F of the chunk divided by the sum of F of chunks. Here's theorem 2.3. Let F be any additive competition function, then for all P and T, the probability that chunk generated by P at time T, at the level of the processor is 0, reaches STM at the time T plus H, the time it takes to move up a tree of height H, is independent of the location of the processor or any other processors. Equivalently, the permutation chosen to assign processors to leaves of the uptree have no effect on the sequence of broadcasts from STM. You can move those processors around, and the broadcasts from STM will remain unchanged. It can be shown that these theorems 2.2 and 2.3 fail for every competition function that is not additive. Our preferred competition functions, well, a simple additive competition function is f of chunk equal to intensity. In our view, the best two additive competition functions are f of chunk equal to intensity plus 1/2 the mood, and f of chunk equal to intensity minus 1/2 the mood. One of these takes a more positive view of life, the other takes a more negative view of life. They both have the desirable properties that first, They are additive, and secondly, they permit positive and negative moods to cancel. Without going into the proof, this is clear when the two chunks are placed as siblings in the competition tree, and more generally, by theorem 2.3, modifying the placement of the two chunks, no matter where they are to be siblings, will have no effect on the content of short-term memory. And that's because these permutations have no effect. Let's look at consciousness. Consciousness in the CTM is defined as awareness of the content of short-term memory, that's STM, by long-term memory, LTM. In the CTM, all hard work is done by the processors, all of which operate unconsciously in LTM. Assuming CTM is a good model for human consciousness, we are conscious of only the gist that is in STM, no more, no less. What is that gist of which you are conscious? It is always one of five things: an inner voice articulating your thoughts, an inner image, a sensation, a feeling, a wordless thought. That's interesting. What's a wordless thought? Like a word that's on the tip of your tongue. You know what you want, you just don't have a word for it. That's it. Consciousness in the model is defined to be the contents of short-term memory. That leaves open the question, what gives rise to the feeling of consciousness? Possible answers? First, all LTM processors know what's in STM. So if any one processor is responsible for that feeling of consciousness, it knows what's in STM. Some LTM processors are particularly responsible for consciousness, such as the inner dialogue processors. In humans, these processors include an inner speech processor that translates all speech in STM's brainish into an inner speech akin to what the ear hears from the external world. An inner vision processor. Brainish here is the language of the brain. Thirdly, what gives rise to the feeling of consciousness? The richness of the language of the brain. What we call brainish is much richer than English. Think of the richness of dreams. The images, sounds, feelings in these dreams are practically indistinguishable from the real thing. You can be in great pain in the dream and wake up with no pain. You can be in bed facing up in the dream and wake up facing down. All the images, sounds, and feelings in a dream are stored in brainish in your brain. You feel them as real because they are essentially the same gists that describe your world when you are awake. And fourth, the model of the world processor, which maintains models of the environment. It has several important jobs, including generating and recalling maps of CTM's world, distinguishing self from not self in those worlds, predicting actions of self and not self in its worlds, planning actions in the environment. What does consciousness do for CTM? Through broadcasts from STM, it focuses LTM processors on generating the current best interpretation of the world. And it serves as a checker on that interpretation. It presents a sketch of what should be focused on in the world. And secondly, consciousness gives the entity, the CTM, the ability to solve unanticipated problems, to deal with a complex world using all the tools at its disposal. Now for our big question, will the CTM have the feeling that it is conscious? Yes or no? We believe that yes, but how do we prove that a CTM feels conscious? We don't. The reasonableness of our definition of consciousness lies entirely in the explanation it gives for consciousness, the extent to which those explanations agree with our intuitive feelings about our own consciousness, the range of concepts that the CTM explains easily and naturally, and the CTM's response to situations unforeseen by CTM's creator. Why? Here are some concepts explainable with the CTM. Why is short-term memory so tiny? One, it ensures that all LTM processors pay attention to the same conscious thought. If STM contained GIST from many processors, it would be unlikely for them all to focus on the same thought. How is a math proof understood? When you have fully understood a math proof, you feel you have its entirety in your hand. What you actually have is a gist, the idea of the proof, with pointers to its definitions and lemmas. How do LTM processors decide what signs to give their weights? In an infant, hunger and pain are negative. Food and love are positive. The infant's signs are built in. Later in life, if sign is not obvious, it can be taken to be that of the current mood. How are the feelings of pain and pleasure to be explained? We are not talking about the knowledge of pain and pleasure. We are talking about the feeling of pain and pleasure. Just because pain is negative and pleasure is positive does not imply that CTM will feel pain and pleasure. So what does make CTM feel pain and pleasure? This brings us to the easy and hard problems. Our formulation, the easy problem, make a robot that simulates feelings like those of pain and joy. The hard problem, make a robot that truly experiences feelings like those of pain and joy. Why the particular interest in pain and joy? Well, first, pain and joy are among the hardest feelings to explain. They are hard to explain scientifically. We need a test for pain, something better than the doctor's test. The pain opioid crisis begs for insight. But the primary thing is, what's the explanation, the scientific explanation to be for creating the feelings of pain and joy? Let's distinguish between simulation and experience. In the disorder called pain asymbolia, the patient knows she has pain, but does not suffer. Adults who get pain asymbolia from a concussion know what pain is, claim they still have pain, but say it's nothing. It no longer bothers them. The robots we build are pain asymbolic. We know how to make them appear to be in pain, but we don't know how to make them feel the pain. So how might the conscious Turing machine experience pain? We tried many explanations. Here are suggestions that cannot be the answer, as attested to by type 2 pain asymbolics who cry out. Pain might arise from observing unconscious reactions such as grimacing, crying out, and such. Response to painful situations such as a finger pulling away from a flame, sweat and increased heart rate, muscles that vibrate, and so on. Since type 2 asymbolics don't feel pain, but do have all of these reactions cannot account for the feeling of pain. We're looking for an explanation that doesn't depend on chemicals, that works as well for machines made of silicon and gold as they do for those made of flesh and blood. We have 3 suggestions for extreme pain, only 3. First, broadcast. Extreme pain is an actor that takes over all short-term memory. It prevents all other actors, chunks, from reaching the stage. Pain messages and only pain messages are broadcast. Every processor knows of the pain. With few exceptions, nothing else can get into STM. And there's confirmation. Under conditions that normally cause agony, pain asymbolics can think, while normals cannot. In a Darwinian design, you might expect pain to lead to constructive thinking, but agony actually interferes with constructive thinking. It forces you to rely on your unconscious self. However, while broadcasts account for some pain, they do not account for the sudden excruciating pain at the moment you tear a ligament. What does? Interrupts. Sudden extreme pain, a finger touching a burning stove, interrupts all unconscious processors. Interrupts, as opposed to broadcasts, cause processors to instantly put their work on a stack, forces them to pay their maximum immediate attention to the interrupt. This differs from broadcasts, which send their information to processors without forcing them to put what they're doing on a stack. And thirdly, concentration on pain reduces pain, but lets fear take its place in STM. Concentration on fear reduces fear, but lets pain take its place in STM. It's a vicious cycle. Which LTM processors are not needed for consciousness? Which LTM processors are needed for consciousness? Most LTM processors are not needed for consciousness. For example, vision and hearing. Helen Keller lost both vision and hearing, but was nevertheless conscious. Face recognition. Lesions in the fusiform face area can affect face recognition to the point that patients with this disorder don't even recognize their own family or themselves. Danger warning processor. SM had a calcified amygdala. She felt no fear, none. Civilizing processor. Phineas Gage lost his entire prefrontal cortex, but he was conscious. Declarative memory. Facts, general knowledge, personal experiences, processors. HM lost all ability to make permanent declarative memories. Curiously, he could still make procedural memories. He was conscious, even though he could not make memories. Procedural memory? Don't know. Some LTM processors essential for consciousness. One, inner dialogue processors for transforming brainish into something akin to outer speech and vision, for commenting, planning, etc. You need to have that in order to do stuff. Inner dialogue processors. A model of the world processor for distinguishing self from not self. Here's a baby who is discovering its left leg. You can hear the parrots in the background. The baby's really amazed. He looks over to his right leg. Can I do it with that? But he can do it with his left leg. Pretty wonderful. So inner dialogue processors, a model of the world processor for distinguishing self from not self. Yes, that was the baby. If Yoda's brain is a CTM, then Yoda is conscious of the rock as self. He just has to think it moving up and down. Some minimal ability to think, including the motivation, the energy, and drive to do it. You know Gordon Gallup's mirror test for self-awareness. It captures the 3 requirements for consciousness. The test is one in which you put some rouge on the child's forehead and then you let it see itself in the mirror. And if the child sees the mark and recognizes it's on itself and tries to get rid of it, then it's said to be self-aware. It means that the child has to have a model of the world for distinguishing self from not self, tries to remove the rouge from itself, not from the child in the mirror. It has to have the ability to plan, to move that hand up there. And it has to have the ability to think, including the motivation and the energy to do it. Do elephants pass the mirror test for self-awareness? Again, you have to first let the elephant see itself in a very big mirror. Very important. It got to recognize itself, and then if it tries to remove that X, it's self-aware. It has that model of the world for distinguishing self from not self, the inner dialogue for planning, and the motivation and the energy to do this. How about children? Do children pass the mirror test? At age 2, they don't. This kid may be 2.5 or 3 years old. Let's see what happens here. Not there. There. How about dogs? Do dogs pass the test for self-awareness? Not the mirror test, because eyesight is not a dog's strong point, but there's a sniff test that the dog passes. I don't know about cows or octopus. How about a fish? Can a fish pass the test? There's a fish called the cleaner wrasse. It's a small fish that you can buy and put into your saltwater aquarium. And this fish does the very strange thing when it's first put in front of a mirror. It does this movement up and down that I've never seen before, and it'll even turn upside down and swim in front of the mirror to check that, yes, what's in the mirror is a copy of itself. And then you put some red stuff on its chin, and when it sees that red stuff, it goes off to a rock, rubs it off, and goes back to check if it succeeded. How about an ant? Can an ant pass the test for self-awareness? There's a species of ant called Myrmica. It's a genus of ant. Myrmica, there are 3 species. And when any of all 3 pass the test, when they see themselves in the mirror, they walk right up on the mirror, they see themselves, they see the mark that's been placed on its forehead, and then they try to rub it off and then look back into the mirror to check if it's there. So we view this test for self-awareness as being a pretty good test also for consciousness. Thank you all. And now Lenore will sum up our views on consciousness.
As stated in part 1, our view of consciousness is that it is a property of all properly organized computing systems, whether made of flesh and blood or metal and silicon. Our thesis is that it is the architecture of these systems and key processors that are able to communicate thoughts, plans, images, and sensations in an expressive inner language, and the dynamics of prediction, feedback, and learning that makes them conscious. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you again.